Hello again, everyone. Today we're going to look at the topic of science in the first 4 chapters of Frankenstein. Science and technology have rarely been more prominent in our daily lives than they currently are. We are rightly sitting at home in lockdown, waiting for what the politicians call the science to tell us that it's safe to return to normality. We hear on a daily basis from the government's chief scientific officer. And we've all become comfortable discussing technical scientific concepts like the R value. We are confident with the idea that scientists will make decisions based on data and that we're okay with the impact those decisions will have on our daily lives. Of course, science and technology have also been discussed in perhaps less reassuring ways in recent weeks. Most obviously, the conspiracy theories surrounding connections between COVID-19 and 5G mobile networks, and claims that the virus emanated from a lab in Wuhan that was researching coronavirus vaccines. These are more malignant views of science and the impact it can have on our daily lives, and they are far from a new trend. In the early 19th century, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein against a backdrop of heavily divided public opinion about scientific advance. We might understand science as the process of testing a particular hypothesis about the world around us by collecting data through experimentation. And surely there can't be anything wrong with that. It just sounds like a sensible way to understand the world around us. However, during Shelley's lifetime, this scientific process, especially in its more extreme and experimental forms, clashed with a number of deeply held views, ideas held sacrosanct because of tradition and religious belief. Luigi Galvani, for example, was an Italian doctor and physicist. In 1780, he discovered that the muscles of a dead frog's legs twitched when they were struck by an electrical spark. To us, that might seem quite an ordinary discovery. To 18th century men and women, who were only recently introduced to the idea of electricity, it seemed that Galvani had harnessed the force that gives living creatures life. Of course, in the prevailing religious belief of the time, only God could control the forces of life. Galvani's science was transgressing the fundamental laws of human existence by taking God's role. Scientists of the early 19th century were also discovering more and more about the human body. The best way to do this was, of course, to study the anatomy of cadavers firsthand, up close. For that, you needed a ready supply of dead bodies. Body snatching became so widespread in this period that it was not unusual for relatives and friends of someone who had just died to watch over the grave, to stop it being violated. The most famous and perhaps gruesome example of this extreme practice in the name of science is the case of Burke and Hare. During 1827 and 1828, the Edinburgh duo brought a new dimension to the trade of selling corpses to doctors by murdering rather than grave robbing and supplying their victims fresh corpses for medical dissection. Shelley wouldn't have known about them until the second publication of Frankenstein, but when she published that in 1831, her depiction of Victor assembling limbs stolen from corpses would have taken on a new moral significance. So the scientific process may have been the greatest gift of the Enlightenment period, but it was fraught with ethical questions and immoral implications for Mary Shelley. She explores this idea particularly in chapters 2 to 4 of her novel, as we see Frankenstein discovering his passion for scientific experimentation, pursuing it further at the University of Ingolstadt, and ultimately beginning his greatest experiment to reanimate the composite parts of stolen human remains that then becomes his monster, his creation. To begin with, in chapter 2, Frankenstein describes the ambition that starts to grow in him to become a scientist. He says, "The world to me was a secret which I desired to divine, curiosity, earnest research to learn the hidden laws of nature." Later on in the same chapter, he says, "It was the secret of heaven and earth which I desired to learn, and whether it was the outward substance of things, or the inner spirit of nature, or the mysterious soul of man, my inquiries were directed to the metaphysical." Now, what should strike you first of all is the semantic field of secrecy here. Intriguingly, everything that Victor wants to discover, he perceives as being a secret. This is an Enlightenment goal, of course, to use the scientific process to discern the truth about nature and the natural world. There's also, quite intriguingly, a kind of jealous tone, perhaps, to what Victor says, implying a jealousy of those people, or maybe those deities, those gods, who know the answer, who know what the hidden laws of nature are. Describing them as the laws of nature imbues the description with a rationality. A law is something measurable, rational, understandable by scientific principles. So from the very beginning, Victor sees that, well, yeah, of course, nature will be something I can measure in order to understand. He wants to understand the secret of heaven and earth. And in this, we have a clearly religious image. An image that implies he is going to transgress, going to invade God's domain. And then finally, he wants to direct his inquiries to the metaphysical. Now, the word metaphysical means beyond the physical, anything that's abstract or spiritual. And what's intriguing here is that Victor is applying the scientific process to those abstract spiritual things, things which most Enlightenment scientists would believe you probably couldn't measure, experiment with, understand through calculation. But Victor wants to go further than previous Enlightenment scientists. Shelley develops this theme of scientific exploration further in chapter 3. Victor describes how, as a child, I had not been content with the results promised by the modern professors of natural science. That's the professors that he's studying with at Ingolstadt University. It was very different when the masters of science sought immortality and power. Now, what's clear in this description is the semantic field of striving, that romantic idea of struggling to achieve something that's difficult to come by, overcoming challenges. We see also how he describes the masters of science, these people who are superior to the modern professors that he's working with, the ancient occult scientists. Agrippa and Paracelsus would be two examples that we looked at in the previous lesson, and I'd encourage you to go back to that context if you're not sure. But what's intriguing is how they, particularly here, are attractive to Frankenstein because of their seeking of power. And in this he reveals his unashamed ambition. There's not a tone of shame or of perhaps guilt at being so ambitious. Instead, he, in a completely unchristian way, accepts ambition and values it. Finally, he describes how as a child he'd not been content with blah blah blah. And this is an intriguing notion for Romantic writer Shelley to explore. The Romantics were fascinated by the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued for the power of education, particularly for children, how it could encourage them to bring the best out of themselves. And in Rousseau's argument, there is only good to be had from education. But there's a hint here in what Shelley is saying that maybe you can take that too far. Maybe you can corrupt that idea. And you can educate children, or indeed children might educate themselves, in a way that ultimately is corrupting. And then finally, in chapter 4, we see Frankenstein addressing this issue of his grave robbing, of his body snatching. He describes how he does not remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition, or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy. A churchyard was, to me, merely the receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which, from being the seat of beauty and strength, had become food for the worm. It's a really striking description, completely lacking in any sense of shame, of what it would be like to steal bodies for scientific research, that completely immoral practice that Shelley takes from her context. What's noticeable is the Gothic semantic field here, the connotations of words like trembled, superstition and darkness, of the uncanny and the Gothic. And of course this is all taking place in a graveyard or a churchyard, the ultimate Gothic setting. However, he is not afraid. He may use the words of the Gothic, but unlike other Gothic protagonists, he doesn't seem to shake with fear at the idea of the churchyard. He approaches these Gothic settings, these Gothic ideas, with a hyper-rationality, the kind of Enlightenment approach that says a body is just a physical thing. He denies the Gothic power of the idea of a body having greater significance. But of course he's also denying the Christian idea of the body being a temple. There's a potential irony here. We might look at the way that Victor talks of bodies being deprived of spirit and think, well, maybe he's the one deprived of spirit. He's the one deprived of compassion. Now, the final line. Did you spot the link to Byron, the allusion to Byron's lines inscribed upon a cup formed from a skull? In that typically romantic poem, Lord Byron described how he thought you could give value and nobility to the remains of a human being after death. Well, here Frankenstein denies that idea. Mary Shelley, in fact, wrote the first draft of Frankenstein in Byron's company, so perhaps it's a coded nod towards his presence in the early genesis of the tale. Now, those are hardly the only references to science and hardly the only descriptions of Victor's scientific thinking as it develops in chapter 2, 3 and 4. Those are just 3 of the examples. Now that I've shown you how to do it, I want you to go through chapter 2, 3 and 4, read them again and find those key quotations that link to science, that tell us something about Victor's scientific thinking, and explode them, annotate them in the same way as I've just done for you as an example. I'm going to end on a quick piece of practical advice. Obviously, we're now 6 lessons into Frankenstein. You've got all these fantastic notes that you've been putting together of the lessons that we've gone through. I want you to make sure you've got all of these in one place, either on your computer or printed out and put into a physical folder. We'll be using these throughout our lessons on the prose, which is of course paper 2 for your A-level literature, and you can use these notes when you come to compare Frankenstein with The Handmaid's Tale. Okay, next time we will be looking at chapter 5 and the moment that Victor brings his creature to life. I'll see you then.